The afternoon sun cast long, dappled shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns of Heather Lodge, where Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth had spared no expense in preparing for what she proudly declared would be the social event of Little Wickham's autumn season. The annual charity garden party, benefiting the local orphanage, had drawn nearly 40 guests from the village and surrounding countryside, all eager to sample Cook's famous cucumber sandwiches and perhaps catch a glimpse of the mysterious new guest staying at the lodge. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her worn but comfortable hat and settled into a wicker chair beneath the ancient oak tree, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she observed the gentle chaos of polite society at play. She had arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, carrying a small contribution to the charity collection and her ever-present carpet bag. From her vantage point, she commanded an excellent view of the proceedings, her mild blue eyes missing little, though her expression remained one of gentle, grandmotherly absorption. The guest of honor was Mr. Sebastian Whitmore, a distinguished gentleman of perhaps 55 years, who had arrived at Heather Lodge 3 days prior under circumstances that had already set the village tongues wagging. Mrs. Ashworth had introduced him simply as an old family friend, though several sharp-eyed residents had noted that she seemed rather nervous whenever his name was mentioned. Mr. Whitmore possessed an effortless charm that drew people to him, moving through the fete like a minor celebrity, his laughter echoing melodiously across the lawn. Miss Marple observed the assembled company with practiced ease. There was young Dr. Pemberton, recently returned from London to take over his father's practice, earnestly discussing modern medicine with the vicar's wife. Mrs. Gladys Pemberton, the doctor's mother, held court near the rose bushes, regaling a small group with tales of her late husband's heroic service in the Great War. The vicar himself, Mr. Reginald Thornby, seemed unusually distracted, his sermon notes forgotten as he cast frequent glances toward their mysterious guest. Perhaps most intriguing was Miss Evelyn Hartwell, Mrs. Ashworth's companion and distant cousin, who had arrived at Heather Lodge 6 months earlier, following what the village gossips whispered was a disappointment in love. She was a handsome woman of perhaps 40, with prematurely silver hair and intelligent dark eyes. Today, however, those usually observant eyes were fixed almost exclusively on Mr. Whitmore, and Miss Marple noted with interest the way Miss Hartwell's hands trembled slightly as she poured tea from the elaborate silver service. The afternoon proceeded with predictable rhythms. Children from the village school performed traditional folk songs, their voices piping sweetly in the warm air. The ladies of the Women's Institute had arranged an impressive display of preserves and handicrafts for sale. Gentlemen discussed cricket and next season's prospects, while their wives exchanged carefully coded observations about neighbors and acquaintances. Miss Marple found herself drawn into conversation with Mrs. Pemberton, who was delighted to discover that the elderly visitor had known her late husband's family. As they chatted about mutual acquaintances, Miss Marple's attention was caught by a brief but intense exchange between Mr. Whitmore and their hostess near the ornamental fountain. Mrs. Ashworth's face had gone quite pale, and she appeared to be pleading with him about something, though their voices were too low to be overheard. The conversation ended abruptly when Miss Hartwell approached with fresh tea, and both participants immediately assumed expressions of polite social interest. As the clock in the village church tower chimed 4:30, Mrs. Ashworth clapped her hands together and announced that it was time for the afternoon's special entertainment. She had arranged for Mr. Whitmore to share some of his experiences from his recent travels in the Orient. The guests arranged themselves in a semicircle around a small wooden platform erected near the house, and Mr. Whitmore stepped forward with easy confidence. He was an accomplished speaker, weaving tales of exotic markets in Hong Kong and mysterious temples in Burma, with just enough detail to seem authentic without becoming tedious. His voice was cultured and pleasant, with just a hint of an accent suggesting extensive time abroad. Yet something about his manner struck Miss Marple as oddly theatrical, as though he were playing a role rather than simply sharing personal experiences. The performance was interrupted quite suddenly by the arrival of Constable Morrison from the village, who approached Mrs. Ashworth with obvious reluctance and whispered something in her ear that caused her to gasp audibly. The constable's news, whatever it was, seemed to concern Mr. Whitmore directly, for Mrs. Ashworth immediately turned toward the platform where he had been speaking only moments before. The platform was empty. Mr. Sebastian Whitmore had vanished as completely as if he had never existed at all, leaving behind only a half-empty teacup and a silk pocket square that fluttered gently in the afternoon breeze. The golden light of the setting sun now seemed to cast longer, more ominous shadows, and Miss Marple felt a familiar prickle of unease. The pattern, she knew instinctively, had just become far more intricate than anyone yet realized. For several heartbeats, the assembled guests remained frozen in a tableau of bewilderment, as though Mr. Whitmore's vanishing act had cast them all under some peculiar spell. Then the silence shattered into a dozen conversations at once. Mrs. Pemberton declared it most extraordinary, while the vicar's wife began fanning herself with her program. Young Tommy Fletcher, the baker's son, piped up with delighted certainty that he'd seen the gentleman disappear behind the roses like a magic trick, earning himself a sharp rebuke from his mortified mother. Mrs. Ashworth stood beside the empty platform, her composure wavering like a candle flame in a draught. "There must be some perfectly reasonable explanation," she said, though her voice carried a tremor that convinced no one, least of all herself. Her gaze swept the grounds desperately, as if expecting Mr. Whitmore to emerge from behind a topiary with an apologetic smile. Constable Morrison, perspiring in his ill-fitting uniform, cleared his throat with obvious reluctance. "Mrs. Ashworth, ma'am, I'm afraid I should mention that I came here on official business. There's been a communication from London regarding a Mr. Sebastian Whitmore. Nothing alarming, you understand. Just some inquiries about certain irregularities in business dealings." He paused, clearly wishing himself anywhere else. "The description they provided does seem to match your house guest." A collective intake of breath rippled through the company. Mrs. Pemberton was heard to murmur, "Well, I never," while several guests exchanged meaningful glances. Miss Marple noticed that Miss Hartwell had gone quite pale and was gripping the back of a garden chair with such force that her knuckles showed white beneath her gloves. "There must be some mistake," Mrs. Ashworth said firmly, though the protest sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Mr. Whitmore is a gentleman of impeccable character. I've known him for—" She hesitated, and Miss Marple filed away that telling pause. "Our families were acquainted years ago." Dr. Pemberton stepped forward with brisk authority. "Whatever the circumstances, we should organize a proper search. The man can't have simply vanished into thin air. Morrison, take the path toward the yew walk. Mr. Evans, if you check the drive-in gates, I'll examine the grounds near the house." As the search parties dispersed with the kind of purposeful energy that the English brought to any crisis, Miss Marple remained in her chair beneath the oak tree. From this vantage point, she commanded an excellent view of both the platform and the various search efforts. More importantly, she could observe who participated with genuine concern and who seemed to be merely going through the motions. She rose carefully and approached the platform where Mr. Whitmore had been speaking only minutes before. The half-empty teacup sat precisely where he had left it, a pale ring on the saucer indicating lemon. Miss Marple remembered distinctly that when Miss Hartwell had offered lemon earlier, he had declined, saying it disagreed with him. The silk pocket square lay nearby, fine quality but with a tiny tear along one edge, as though it had caught on something sharp. She touched it delicately with her gloved finger, noting the faint scent of orris root rather than the bay rum or cologne one might expect from a gentleman's handkerchief. "Most peculiar business," observed Mrs. Pemberton, settling into the adjacent chair with a sigh. "Did you notice anything odd about Mr. Whitmore during his talk?" "He was certainly an accomplished speaker," Miss Marple replied mildly, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. "Though I did wonder about some of his tales. That story about the temple in Burma seemed rather—well, rather like something one might read in a travel book than experience firsthand. Their quiet conversation was interrupted by a shout from the direction of the ornamental pond. Mr. Pritchard, the gardener, was waving his cap and calling for the constable. The remaining guests hurried toward the commotion, Miss Marple following at her own measured pace. At the pond's edge, caught among the ornamental reeds, floated Mr. Whitmore's distinctive Panama hat and Malacca walking stick. The water was dark and still, reflecting the late afternoon sky like black glass. Constable Morrison arrived at a run, his face flushed with exertion and growing anxiety. "We'll need to search the water," he announced grimly, though his tone suggested he had little idea how to accomplish this task. The assembled guests stood in shocked silence, the pleasant garden party having taken a decidedly sinister turn. Miss Marple studied the scene with quiet intensity. The hat and stick floated near the surface, but the pond's muddy banks showed no signs of disturbance, no footprints or evidence of a struggle. The positioning seemed almost theatrical, too perfectly arranged to be the result of accident or violence. She glanced back toward the platform, noting the direct line of sight between the two locations, then let her gaze drift to the dense laurel hedge that bordered the property. Young Dr. Pemberton was already rolling up his sleeves, preparing to wade into the shallow water, when Mr. Evans the butler approached with news that shifted the entire complexion of the search. "Begging your pardon, Constable, but I found something rather odd. The side gate leading to Baker's Lane is standing open, and there are marks in the soft earth. 2 sets of footprints, I'd say, and quite fresh." As the search parties redirected their efforts toward this new discovery, Miss Marple remained by the pond, her mind quietly cataloguing the afternoon's accumulating oddities. A gentleman who declined lemon but drank it, a silk handkerchief scented with orris root, and now a carefully staged scene at the water's edge, while the real trail led elsewhere entirely. The pattern was beginning to emerge, though she suspected the full picture would prove far more complex than anyone yet imagined. The church clock chimed 5, its melancholy notes drifting across the grounds where shadows were growing longer and the mystery deeper with each passing moment. The search party's expedition to Baker's Lane yielded results that were both illuminating and troubling. Constable Morrison returned to the lodge grounds with mud on his boots and a grim expression that immediately commanded the attention of the remaining guests. Behind him trudged Dr. Pemberton and several village men, their earlier enthusiasm dampened by what they had discovered. "The tracks are clear enough," Morrison announced to the assembled company, pulling out his notebook with official importance. 2 sets of footprints, as Mr. Evans observed. One matches the size we'd expect from Mr. Whitmore's shoes, the other considerably smaller. They follow the lane for perhaps a quarter mile before reaching the main road, where we found tire marks in the soft verge. Mrs. Pemberton leaned forward eagerly. "Tire marks? Then he was taken away in a motor car." "So it would appear," the constable replied, though his tone suggested the matter was far from settled. "The peculiar thing is the nature of the smaller prints. They're from a lady's boot, I'd say, those sturdy ones. Not the sort for drawing-room wear." Miss Marple, who had been quietly examining the silk pocket square left on the platform, looked up with mild interest. The fabric, she had noted, carried not only the scent of orris root, but also a tiny smear of what appeared to be face powder along one edge. Most curious for a gentleman's handkerchief, particularly one belonging to a man who had seemed so meticulous about his appearance. Dr. Pemberton cleared his throat importantly. "I examined the area around the gate quite thoroughly. There are signs of haste, scuffed earth, a small tear in the hedge where someone brushed against it carelessly, but no indication of violence or struggle." "Which suggests," observed the vicar thoughtfully, "that Mr. Whitmore departed willingly with his companion." This pronouncement sparked immediate debate among the guests. Mrs. Pemberton declared it highly suspicious, while young Tommy Fletcher's mother whispered that she had always found something not quite right about their mysterious visitor. The speculation grew increasingly elaborate, with theories ranging from romantic elopement to criminal conspiracy. Miss Marple listened to these discussions while her fingers worked steadily at her knitting, but her attention was drawn repeatedly to the two women who had remained conspicuously quiet throughout the proceedings. Mrs. Ashworth stood near the French doors, her face pale and drawn, occasionally pressing a handkerchief to her lips as though fighting nausea. More intriguing still was Miss Hartwell, who had positioned herself where she could observe both the guests and her employer, her dark eyes alert and watchful. When Constable Morrison mentioned the lady's boot prints, Miss Marple noticed Miss Hartwell's hand move instinctively toward her skirt, as though checking something. The gesture was so brief it might have been unconscious, but it did not escape Miss Marple's practiced observation. She also noted that Miss Hartwell's usually immaculate appearance showed small signs of distress. A loose hairpin, a slight smudge on her glove, and most tellingly, a faint dusting of powder on her sleeve that caught the late afternoon light. "Constable," Miss Marple said gently, "did you happen to notice whether the lady's footprints showed any particular characteristics? I find that shoes often tell such interesting stories about their wearers." Morrison consulted his notes importantly. "Well, ma'am, they were neat prints, I'll give you that. Small but firm, suggesting someone accustomed to walking. The heel was low and practical, not fashionable, and there was something odd about the left foot, a slight drag mark as though the wearer favored that side." Miss Hartwell's face went quite white at this observation, and she moved slightly behind Mrs. Ashworth as though seeking shelter. Miss Marple filed this reaction away with her other accumulating observations. The butler, Evans, approached Mrs. Ashworth with deferential concern. "Ma'am, I've taken the liberty of securing Mr. Whitmore's room as the constable requested. However, I should mention that very little of his belongings remain. A few items of clothing, his shaving kit, but no personal papers or valuables. Most peculiar for a gentleman planning an extended stay." "Perhaps," suggested Dr. Pemberton, "he never intended to stay long. The whole visit might have been arranged with this disappearance in mind?" Mrs. Ashworth's composure finally cracked. "How can you suggest such a thing? Sebastian was my guest. Whatever his reasons for leaving, I'm certain they were perfectly legitimate." The use of the past tense did not go unnoticed by Miss Marple, nor did the tremor in Mrs. Ashworth's voice when she spoke her former guest's Christian name. There was a familiarity there that suggested more than casual acquaintance, despite her earlier claims to barely remember him. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, a new complication arose. Young Tommy Fletcher, who had been exploring the grounds with the irrepressible curiosity of youth, came running from the direction of the rose garden with something clutched in his grubby fist. "Found this by the sundial," he announced breathlessly, holding up a small object that glinted in the fading light. It was a lady's earring, delicate and expensive, with a distinctive pattern of seed pearls surrounding a small sapphire. The setting was modern, clearly not an antique piece, and it appeared to have been dropped recently, as there was no tarnish or dirt upon it. Mrs. Ashworth stared at the earring with obvious recognition, her hand moving unconsciously to her own ear. Miss Hartwell's reaction was even more telling. She stepped backward as though the small piece of jewelry might somehow harm her, her face a mask of barely controlled panic. "How extraordinary," Miss Marple murmured, accepting the earring from Tommy's eager grasp. "Such a lovely piece. I wonder how long it's been lying there." The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, and Miss Marple sensed that the afternoon's mysteries were far from over. The pattern was becoming clearer, though she suspected the full picture would prove more complex than anyone yet imagined. The delicate sapphire earring lay in Miss Marple's palm like a small accusation, its seed pearls catching the fading afternoon light with an almost mocking gleam. The silence that followed Tommy Fletcher's discovery stretched uncomfortably, broken only by the distant sound of the church bell chiming the quarter hour. Each guest seemed frozen in place, as though the small piece of jewelry possessed some peculiar power to render them all speechless. Mrs. Ashworth was the first to find her voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. That's Evelyn's earring," she said, her hand moving instinctively to her own ear. "She was wearing the pair this morning at breakfast. I complimented her on them particularly." Her gaze sought out Miss Hartwell, who had retreated further into the shadows cast by the French doors, her face a mask of barely controlled panic. "Miss Hartwell," Constable Morrison said with newfound authority, "would you confirm whether this belongs to you?" Miss Hartwell's composure, which had been wavering throughout the afternoon's events, finally began to crack in earnest. She pressed her lips together as though physically restraining words that threatened to escape, her dark eyes darting between the earring and Mrs. Ashworth's stricken face. That is to say, it does appear to be mine," she admitted reluctantly, "though I cannot imagine how it came to be by the sundial. I haven't been near that part of the garden all afternoon." Dr. Pemberton stepped forward with professional interest, producing a small magnifying glass from his medical bag. "May I examine it more closely, Constable? Sometimes jewelry carries identifying marks." After a moment's scrutiny, he looked up with evident surprise. "There's an inscription on the back of the setting, very small but quite clear. To E.H. with devotion, C.M." The initials hung in the air like smoke from a gun, and Miss Marple observed with interest how Miss Hartwell's face went from pale to ashen. The woman swayed slightly, and Mrs. Ashworth moved instinctively to steady her, though her own hands were trembling. "C.M., mused the vicar thoughtfully. "Those initials don't correspond to anyone in our immediate circle. A gentleman from your past, perhaps, Miss Hartwell." The question seemed to cause Miss Hartwell physical pain. She closed her eyes briefly, gathering herself with visible effort. "Charles Montague," she said finally, her voice barely audible. We were engaged several years ago. The engagement was terminated when certain irregularities in his business affairs came to light. Miss Marple's knitting needles had ceased their rhythmic clicking, and she regarded Miss Hartwell with gentle but penetrating interest. The pieces of a more complex puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves in her mind, though she sensed the complete picture remained tantalizingly elusive. Constable Morrison was scribbling furiously in his notebook, his earlier confusion replaced by the satisfaction of tangible evidence. "Miss Hartwell, I must ask directly, when did you last see this earring? And are you absolutely certain you have had no recent contact with this Charles Montague?" Before Miss Hartwell could respond, Mrs. Ashworth made a sound that was half sob, half gasp of recognition. All eyes turned to her as she sank heavily into the nearest garden chair, her face a portrait of anguish and growing comprehension. "Oh, Evelyn," she whispered, her voice breaking, "what have you done?" The words fell into the gathering dusk with the weight of a confession, creating ripples of implication that spread through the assembled company like stones cast into still water. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her mild blue eyes sharp with understanding. "Mrs. Ashworth," she said gently, "I believe you recognize Mr. Whitmore by another name, don't you?" The silence stretched taut as piano wire. Mrs. Ashworth looked from Miss Marple to Miss Hartwell and back again, her internal struggle visible on her features like clouds passing across the sun. Finally, she spoke in a voice that seemed to come from a great distance. "Sebastian Whitmore was not his real name. I knew him as Charles Montague, though it has been nearly 7 years since I last saw him. He came to me 3 days ago, claiming to be in some sort of financial difficulty, asking for sanctuary while he arranged passage to the continent." Miss Hartwell's remaining composure shattered completely. "Cordelia, no! You promised you wouldn't tell anyone. You gave me your word." "But Evelyn, don't you see? If Charles has truly disappeared, if something dreadful has happened to him, we cannot continue this deception. The constable must know the truth of the matter." The revelation sent a buzz of excitement through the remaining guests, who had been following the exchange with the rapt attention of theater-goers witnessing a particularly gripping drama. Here was the stuff of village legend, mysterious strangers, hidden identities, and now the suggestion of romantic entanglements gone awry. Dr. Pemberton stepped forward with growing concern. "Mrs. Ashworth, are you saying that you knowingly provided shelter to a man who was being sought by the authorities? And Miss Hartwell, you were aware of his true identity throughout his stay?" "It wasn't like that," Miss Hartwell said desperately, her voice rising with emotion. "When Charles arrived, I was as shocked as anyone. I thought never to see him again after what happened in London. But he seemed genuinely frightened, claimed that powerful men were pursuing him over a business matter that had gone terribly wrong." "And you believed him?" Constable Morrison asked with obvious skepticism. "I wanted to believe him," she admitted, her voice breaking. "Despite everything that had passed between us, I still had feelings for him. When he asked for help, when he begged me to convince Cordelia to let him stay until he could arrange safe passage abroad, I found I couldn't refuse him." Miss Marple absorbed this revelation with the calm acceptance of someone who had suspected as much from the beginning, though certain details continued to trouble her methodical mind. The silk pocket square scented with orris root, the teacup marked with lemon despite Mr. Whitmore's stated aversion to it, the almost theatrical placement of the hat and walking stick in the ornamental pond. Each element seemed designed to create a specific impression, but whether that impression reflected truth or deception remained to be determined. "Miss Hartwell," she said kindly, "the footprints leading to Baker's Lane suggest that you accompanied Mr. Montague when he left the grounds. What was the nature of your conversation during that walk?" The question struck home with devastating accuracy. Miss Hartwell's last defenses crumbled entirely, and she began to weep with the desperate abandon of someone whose carefully constructed world had finally collapsed around her. "I didn't want him to go," she sobbed. "He said it was too dangerous to remain, that his enemies would find him eventually. He asked me to come with him, to start fresh somewhere far from England. But I couldn't abandon Cordelia, not after all her kindness to me." "So you walked with him to the lane to say goodbye?" Morrison pressed. "Yes," she whispered. We argued. He accused me of choosing comfort over love, and I told him that I had learned the difference between love and infatuation through bitter experience. When the motor car arrived, he simply got in and drove away without another word." The constable closed his notebook with an air of satisfaction. To his mind, the mystery was essentially solved. A woman had aided her former lover's escape, lost an earring in the process, and was now facing the consequences of her romantic folly. It was the sort of case that would be easily understood by magistrates and juries alike. But Miss Marple remained troubled by the accumulating inconsistencies. If Miss Hartwell had indeed accompanied Mr. Montague willingly to his waiting transport, why the elaborate deception with the hat and walking stick in the pond? Why the careful staging of evidence that suggested something far more sinister than a simple elopement? And most puzzling of all, why would a man fleeing from powerful enemies choose to make such a public spectacle of his departure? As the last of the afternoon light faded into evening, and the guests began to disperse with the satisfied air of people who had witnessed something memorable, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to take her leave. The obvious solution had presented itself with almost suspicious convenience, but her long experience with human nature suggested that the truth was rarely so accommodating. The real mystery, she suspected, was only just beginning to unfold. The church clock chimed 6, its melancholy notes drifting across the grounds where shadows were growing longer, and the questions deeper with each passing moment. As the last guests departed Heather Lodge, and the servants began clearing the remnants of the disrupted garden party, Miss Marple lingered near the tea service with the unobtrusive persistence of someone genuinely helpful. The evening shadows were lengthening, but her mild curiosity about the afternoon's events seemed to require just a few more moments of quiet observation. Evans, the butler, was directing the collection of china with his usual efficiency when Miss Marple detained him with a gentle inquiry that sounded entirely innocent. "Such a quantity of cups and saucers, Mr. Evans. You managed the service beautifully despite all the confusion. I do hope nothing was broken in the excitement." "Very kind of you to say, miss," Evans replied, gratified by the acknowledgement. "We had 3 separate tea services running, one by the platform where Mr. Whitmore was speaking, another near the French doors, and a third brought out when the first ran low. Miss Hartwell supervised the platform service personally, while Lucy, our housemaid, managed the refills." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle clicking as she processed this information. "And Mr. Whitmore's final cup, the one left on the platform?" Evans paused, consulting his excellent memory. "Curious thing about that, miss. He'd specifically requested plain tea earlier. Quite emphatic about it, said lemon disagreed with him. But the cup he left behind clearly had lemon. I noticed the ring on the saucer and the tongs nearby. People do change their minds, I suppose." "Indeed they do," Miss Marple agreed mildly, though her eyes had sharpened with interest. She moved closer to examine the tea service, noting a faint smear of face powder on one of the lemon tongs, barely visible unless one were looking for such things. "I wonder, Mr. Evans, were there any unusual visitors to the house in recent days?" "Sometimes strangers notice details that escape those familiar with the household." The butler's expression grew thoughtful. "Now that you mention it, miss, there was a gentleman yesterday claiming to be from Norton and Bell Shipping, said he had a message for Mr. Whitmore. Odd sort, wore a chauffeur's cap, but had the bearing of someone more accustomed to giving orders than taking them. Mrs. Ashworth wouldn't see him, said Mr. Whitmore was resting." Miss Marple filed this information away with the same care she might reserve for a particularly complex knitting pattern. As Evans continued his duties, she drifted toward the side gate leading to Baker's Lane, where Constable Morrison's investigation had focused. The footprints were still visible in the soft earth, but Miss Marple's attention was drawn to details the constable had overlooked. Near the gate itself, the laurel hedge showed a small, bright snag. Using one of her knitting needles with dignified precision, she teased out a fragment of very fine silk, pale and delicate, quite possibly from a lady's handkerchief rather than a gentleman's pocket square. Several leaves in the hedge bore traces of a beige powder that clung to her glove when she touched them. More intriguingly, the ground on the garden side of the gate showed the faint impression of a heel that had pressed inward rather than outward. Someone had entered through this gate earlier in the day, not merely departed through it. The pattern suggested careful planning rather than spontaneous flight. Her investigation was interrupted by the approach of Mrs. Ashworth, who had emerged from the house with the distracted air of someone seeking solitude but finding instead the need for companionship. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to remain. I find myself quite unable to settle after this afternoon's distressing events." "Perfectly understandable, my dear," Miss Marple replied with gentle sympathy. "Such revelations about Mr. Whitmore, or rather Mr. Montague, must have been deeply shocking, though I confess myself puzzled by certain small details." Mrs. Ashworth's face tightened at the mention of the name. "What sort of details?" "Oh, nothing significant, I'm sure. It's simply that Evans mentioned Mr. Montague's aversion to lemon in his tea, yet the cup he left behind clearly contained it. And then there was his handkerchief. Such an unusual scent, rather like orris root. Not typically masculine, I would have thought. A flicker of something, recognition perhaps, or concern crossed Mrs. Ashworth's features. Charles was always rather particular about such things, though I must say his preferences seem to have changed considerably since I knew him years ago. He used to take lemon with his tea quite regularly. This contradiction struck Miss Marple as profoundly significant. If Mrs. Ashworth remembered Montague as someone who enjoyed lemon, yet he had specifically declined it yesterday, while somehow ending up with it in his final cup, the implications were troubling indeed. Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Pemberton, who approached with obvious concern. "Mrs. Ashworth, I've been looking for you. Miss Hartwell has taken to her room and refuses to see anyone, including Constable Morrison. She seems quite distraught, beyond what one might expect from mere embarrassment." "Poor Evelyn," Mrs. Ashworth murmured, though her tone carried an undercurrent of something less charitable than sympathy. She blames herself for not having been firmer with Charles when he first arrived. Miss Marple's needles had stilled completely as she absorbed the implications of this exchange. The pieces of a far more complex puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves in her mind, though the complete picture remained frustratingly elusive. As they prepared to return to the house, Miss Marple paused by the ornamental pond where Mr. Whitmore's hat and walking stick had been discovered. In the fading light, she noticed something that had escaped earlier attention, a small depression in the soft earth near the water's edge, as though someone had knelt there recently. Nearby, almost hidden among the reeds, lay a torn fragment of paper. She retrieved it carefully, noting the expensive stationery and partial text visible in the dying light. "You will bring nothing that can be traced to you. No jewelry, no monogrammed articles. No mistakes, Evelyn." The letter fragment seemed to burn in her gloved fingers as the full implications struck her. This was not the random note of a fleeing criminal, but careful instruction from someone who understood the importance of eliminating evidence. The theatrical placement of the hat and stick, the carefully staged footprints leading to Baker's Lane, even Miss Hartwell's tearful confession, all began to take on the character of an elaborate performance designed to conceal a far more sinister truth. As the church clock chimed 7 and full darkness settled over Heather Lodge, Miss Marple realized that the obvious solution, a romantic elopement gone wrong, was merely the surface of a mystery that ran far deeper than anyone yet suspected. The vanishing guest, she now understood, had not simply disappeared. He had been made to disappear, and the person responsible had taken extraordinary care to ensure that the truth would remain buried beneath layers of carefully constructed deception. The real investigation, Miss Marple knew with quiet certainty, was only just beginning. The torn fragment of paper seemed to pulse with significance in Miss Marple's gloved hand as she made her way back toward the warmth of Heather Lodge. The evening air carried the scent of jasmine and something else, a faint medicinal odor that seemed oddly out of place in the garden setting. The words, "no jewelry, no monogrammed articles, no mistakes," Evelyn suggested a level of premeditation that transformed the afternoon's events from romantic folly into something far more calculated. She found Mrs. Ashworth in the drawing room, seated by the dying fire with a half-empty glass of sherry clutched in trembling hands. The composed hostess of the afternoon had given way to a woman whose carefully maintained facade was cracking under the weight of accumulated revelations. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Ashworth said, her voice hoarse with strain, "I confess I feel quite unstrung by today's events. Nothing seems to make sense anymore." "Indeed, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently, settling into the adjacent chair, "though sometimes the pieces of a puzzle become clearer when examined in quieter moments." She paused, studying her hostess's drawn features. "I wonder if I might speak with your housemaid Lucy. I noticed she managed the tea service so efficiently despite all the confusion." Mrs. Ashworth nodded distractedly and rang for Evans, who appeared with his usual silent efficiency. Within moments, Lucy arrived, her cheeks still pink from the evening's work, eager to be helpful despite the lateness of the hour. "You managed splendidly today, my dear," Miss Marple said warmly. "I particularly noticed how attentive you were to Mr. Whitmore's preferences. Tell me, did anyone give you specific instructions about his tea?" Lucy's brow furrowed with concentration. "Miss Hartwell spoke to me twice about it, ma'am. First, she said to be sure his cup was properly warmed. Then, just before his talk began, she told me quite firmly that Mr. Whitmore must have his tea plain, no lemon at all. I remember because I'd already placed a slice beside his saucer, and she whisked it away herself. And later, during his speech. That's the odd thing, ma'am. When I brought fresh tea during his talk, I found his cup had been moved, and there was a clear lemon ring on the saucer. I thought perhaps I'd muddled things, but Miss Hartwell took charge of it immediately. Said she'd see to his refreshment personally. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she absorbed this information. The pattern was becoming clearer. Someone had deliberately altered Mr. Whitmore's tea, adding the very ingredient he had supposedly refused. But whether this was done to him or by him remained tantalizingly unclear. One more question, dear. Miss Hartwell's lovely earrings, the sapphire ones with seed pearls? Did she wear them throughout the day? Oh, no, ma'am. She had them on at breakfast, and I did admire them particularly. But when she came down to help with the preparations, she'd taken them off. I suppose she thought them too fine for garden work. After Lucy departed, Miss Marple produced the paper fragment she had discovered by the pond. I found this near the water, Mrs. Ashworth. The handwriting appears quite distinctive. Mrs. Ashworth accepted the torn paper with obvious reluctance, her face growing pale as she read the few visible words. "This is Evelyn's writing," she whispered. "I'd recognize it anywhere. She's helped me with correspondence for months." Her voice broke slightly. "But why would she write such instructions? And to whom?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "you might tell me more about your history with Mr. Montague. I sense there are details that might illuminate today's events." Mrs. Ashworth stared into the dying fire, her composure wavering like candlelight in a draught. "Charles and I were very close once, years ago. He was brilliant, charming, full of ambitious schemes. He was involved in what he called international ventures, import trade, precious artifacts from the Orient. When everything collapsed, when the scandal broke about irregularities in his business dealings, he simply vanished. I never expected to see him again. Yet when he appeared 3 days ago, you recognized him immediately?" "Of course I did. Despite the years, despite everything that had happened, Charles was unmistakable. His voice, his mannerisms, that particular way he had of commanding attention." She paused, doubt creeping into her voice, though I must admit, some things seemed different. His tea preferences, for instance. I distinctly remembered him enjoying lemon, yet he claimed it had always disagreed with him. Miss Marple's needles stilled completely. "How very interesting. Sometimes people forget the small details when they're trying to be someone they once were." The implication hung in the evening air like smoke. Mrs. Ashworth's sherry glass clinked against the mantelpiece as her hand trembled. "What are you suggesting?" Before Miss Marple could respond, their conversation was interrupted by the sound of voices from the conservatory, low, urgent tones that carried the unmistakable quality of clandestine discussion. Miss Marple rose quietly and moved toward the glass doors, her soft slippers making no sound on the Persian carpet. Through the gap in the curtains, she could see 2 figures near the ornamental fountain, Mrs. Ashworth's companion, Miss Hartwell, and a man in a dark overcoat whose face remained hidden in shadow. Their conversation was brief but intense, ending when the stranger pressed something into Miss Hartwell's hand before disappearing into the laurel hedge that bordered the property. Miss Marple returned to her chair as Miss Hartwell entered through the French doors, her face composed but her hands visibly shaking. "Cordelia, I've been looking for you. I wanted to apologize again for today's dreadful business." "There's no need, Evelyn," Mrs. Ashworth replied, though her eyes searched her companion's face with newfound suspicion, "though I confess myself puzzled by certain aspects of Charles's visit. Miss Marple has raised some rather troubling questions." Miss Hartwell's gaze flicked nervously between the 2 women, her composure finally beginning to crack under the accumulated strain. In that moment of vulnerability, Miss Marple glimpsed the truth that had been carefully hidden beneath layers of romantic deception and staged evidence. The vanishing guest at Heather Lodge, she now understood with quiet certainty, had not simply disappeared. He had been replaced, manipulated, or perhaps eliminated entirely by forces far more sophisticated than anyone yet suspected. The real mystery was only beginning to unfold. The silence that followed Miss Hartwell's entrance stretched like a taut wire, each second adding weight to the unspoken questions that hung in the drawing-room air. Miss Marple's needles had stilled completely, her mild blue eyes observing the interplay of emotions across her companions' faces with the quiet intensity of someone reading a particularly absorbing novel. Miss Hartwell remained standing by the French doors, her usual graceful composure replaced by a brittle tension that seemed ready to shatter at the slightest provocation. Most telling was the way she kept her left hand pressed against her coat pocket, protecting something hidden within, while her right hand unconsciously worried at a loose button on her sleeve. "Evelyn, dear," Mrs. Ashworth said with forced lightness, "you mentioned a messenger. How curious that anyone should call at such a late hour, particularly on such an evening as this." "It was nothing of consequence," Miss Hartwell replied quickly, though her voice carried a tremor that convinced no one. "Simply a delivery that had been delayed from London, some correspondence that required immediate attention." Miss Marple tilted her head with gentle curiosity. How very efficient of the postal service to work such long hours, though I suppose urgent matters do require prompt handling. She paused, studying the torn fragment still lying on the side table. "I was just reflecting on how particular handwriting can be. Take this note, for instance. The formation of the letters is quite distinctive. The way the E is shaped, with that little flourish at the bottom. Quite unmistakable, really." Miss Hartwell's gaze fixed on the paper with the fascination of a bird watching a snake. "I'm sure I wouldn't know anything about that," she said, though her voice had grown smaller. "Of course not, dear," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "Though it did remind me of something else I noticed this afternoon. That lovely silk pocket square Mr. Whitmore left behind. Such an unusual scent clinging to it. Orris root, I believe, though gentlemen typically prefer bay rum or cologne. And then there was that faint dusting of powder along the edge, most peculiar for a gentleman's handkerchief." Mrs. Ashworth leaned forward with growing alarm. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "Oh, nothing at all, really. Simply that sometimes things are not quite what they appear to be. Take Mr. Whitmore himself, or rather, the gentleman we knew as Mr. Whitmore. Such a charming speaker, though I did notice certain inconsistencies in his manner." The word fell into the room like a stone cast into still water. Miss Hartwell's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, where a faint red mark was barely visible above her collar, the sort of irritation that might result from nervous scratching, or perhaps the pressure of unfamiliar fabric. "What sort of inconsistencies?" Mrs. Ashworth asked, though her voice suggested she was beginning to fear the answer. "Well, there was the matter of the tea, of course. Evans mentioned that Mr. Whitmore had been quite emphatic about his aversion to lemon, yet the cup he left behind clearly contained it. And then his stories about the Orient, so vivid, so detailed, yet somehow they reminded me more of travel literature than personal experience." Miss Marple's knitting resumed its gentle rhythm as she continued her observations. "But perhaps most curious of all was his reaction to your reminiscences, Mrs. Ashworth. I noticed that he never volunteered specific memories of his own, but rather responded to yours, rather like an accomplished actor following another performer's lead." The implications of this observation struck Mrs. Ashworth with visible force. She stared at Miss Marple with dawning horror. "Are you suggesting that that the man we knew as Charles wasn't really—" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said gently, "that someone took considerable care to create the impression of being Charles Montague, while perhaps not possessing the intimate knowledge that years of genuine acquaintance would provide." Miss Hartwell's composure finally began to crack in earnest. She moved closer to the fireplace with jerky, uncontrolled movements, her face a mask of barely suppressed panic. "You don't understand," she whispered. "None of you understand what really happened here." Before anyone could respond, The sound of motor cars approaching along the drive interrupted the tense scene. Through the drawing-room windows, they could see the sweep of headlamps across the gravelled courtyard, followed by the slamming of car doors and the murmur of official voices. Evans appeared in the doorway with his usual silent efficiency. "Inspector Mallory from County, ma'am," he announced, "and a gentleman from Norton and Bell Shipping who says his business is most urgent." Mrs. Ashworth rose unsteadily, her face pale in the lamplight. "Show them in, Evans." As they waited for the official party to arrive, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a small detail that had escaped notice until now. On the mantelpiece, beside Mrs. Ashworth's collection of Staffordshire figures, lay a gentleman's comb, silver-backed and monogrammed with the initials S. W. Caught in its teeth was a single strand of hair, but it was far too fine and pale to belong to the dark-haired gentleman who had charmed the afternoon's guests. "Most interesting," she murmured, rising to examine the comb more closely. The hair appeared to be from a wig or hairpiece, the sort used in theatrical productions to alter one's appearance. Combined with the orris root scent and the face powder traces, a picture was beginning to emerge of someone who had taken extraordinary care to transform their appearance. Inspector Mallory entered with the brisk authority of a man accustomed to serious matters, followed by a nervous gentleman in shipping clerk's attire who clutched a leather portfolio against his chest. The inspector's sharp eyes took in the assembled company with professional assessment. "Ladies, I apologize for the late hour, but we've received some rather disturbing information regarding a Mr. Sebastian Whitmore who was believed to be staying at this address. Mr. Thornfield here represents Norton and Bell Shipping, and he has some rather urgent matters to discuss." The shipping clerk stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "Inspector, I must report that our company has been the victim of an elaborate fraud. Someone using the name Sebastian Whitmore obtained passage to the continent using forged documents and stolen credentials. We've been tracking this individual for several days, and our investigations led us here." Miss Hartwell's remaining defenses crumbled entirely. She sank into the nearest chair, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with suppressed emotion. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears and something that might have been relief. "He wasn't Charles," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The man who came here, who charmed us all with his stories and his manner, he wasn't Charles Montague at all. He was someone else entirely, someone who had studied Charles's history carefully enough to fool those who had known him years ago." The confession hung in the evening air like smoke from a dying fire, and Miss Marple understood that the mystery of the vanishing guest had taken a turn far more complex than anyone had anticipated. The real investigation, she knew with quiet certainty, was only now beginning to reveal its true dimensions. Inspector Mallory's penetrating gaze fixed upon Miss Hartwell with the practiced intensity of a man accustomed to extracting truth from reluctant witnesses. The shipping agent, Mr. Thornfield, clutched his leather portfolio with nervous energy, clearly relieved that the afternoon's events were finally being taken seriously by the proper authorities. "Miss Hartwell," the inspector began with professional precision, "you have admitted that the man calling himself Sebastian Whitmore was an impostor. I need you to understand the gravity of this situation. We are dealing with sophisticated criminal fraud, and your cooperation is essential." Miss Hartwell's composure, already fragile, seemed to crumble further under the weight of official scrutiny. She pressed her handkerchief to her lips, fighting back fresh tears. "Inspector, I was as deceived as anyone. The resemblance to Charles was extraordinary, and his knowledge of our past seemed impossible to fabricate." Mr. Thornfield stepped forward, opening his portfolio with shaking hands. "Inspector, if I may present the evidence we've gathered. This man obtained passage to the continent using forged letters of credit bearing the name Sebastian Whitmore. We have documentation showing that these credentials were stolen from our London office 3 weeks ago. He produced a telegram and several carbon copies, each bearing official stamps. Moreover, we traced a request for funds to the Little Wickham post office, sent yesterday afternoon and signed E. Hartwell. All eyes turned to Miss Hartwell, who seemed to shrink into her chair. "I sent a telegram. Yes," she whispered. "He said it was merely to confirm that certain travel documents would be available for collection. I thought I was helping him arrange legitimate passage abroad." Miss Marple, who had been quietly examining the silver-backed comb from the mantelpiece, looked up with gentle curiosity. A telegram to arrange document collection would typically involve a key of some sort, would it not? Rather like the railway left luggage system. As if summoned by her observation, Miss Hartwell's hand moved instinctively to her coat pocket. With obvious reluctance, she withdrew a small brass key attached to a faded ribbon. "This was given to me not half an hour ago, in the conservatory. A man in a dark overcoat said it was urgent, that innocent people might be harmed if I failed to pass it along." Inspector Mallory accepted the key with interest, noting the railway markings. "Left luggage, as Miss Marple suspected. This suggests our impostor had accomplices, people prepared to continue his scheme even after his disappearance." Before anyone could respond further, Evans appeared in the doorway with evident distress. "Inspector, if you please, we've found Mr. Pritchard, the gardener, unconscious in the potting shed. He's been struck on the head." The news sent a shock through the assembled company. Dr. Pemberton, who had lingered after the afternoon's events, immediately offered his services, and the group made their way across the darkened grounds to the small outbuilding where Pritchard lay insensible on a sack of peat. While Dr. Pemberton tended to the injured man, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to an overturned biscuit tin on a rough wooden shelf. Inside, she discovered a small cache of theatrical supplies, spirit gum, grease paint, and a powder puff that still carried the distinctive scent of orris root. "How very illuminating," she murmured, showing the contents to Inspector Mallory. "Our Sebastian Whitmore prepared his disguise with considerable care. This explains the wig hair caught in his comb and the powder traces I noticed on his pocket square." "Someone with access to the grounds," Mallory observed grimly. "Someone familiar with the household routines who could use this shed without arousing suspicion." When they returned to the house, Evans approached Mrs. Ashworth with obvious reluctance. "Ma'am, I'm afraid I must report that the study safe has been tampered with. Sir Lionel's service revolver is missing, along with several important documents." The revelation that a weapon had been stolen cast an even darker shadow over the evening's events. Miss Hartwell appeared close to collapse, her face pale and drawn in the lamplight. "Inspector," she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "there's more you must know. The man who impersonated Charles wasn't working alone. He spoke of a criminal organization, people with substantial resources who specialized in elaborate deceptions. He said they had been tracking Charles Montague's hidden assets for years." She paused, gathering strength for what came next. "When Charles's business collapsed 7 years ago, he had moved substantial sums through foreign banks, hidden accounts that only he could access. This organization somehow learned of their existence and has been systematically hunting for the access codes ever since." Mr. Thornfield nodded vigorously. "This confirms our worst fears. Norton and Bell has been investigating similar cases across 3 countries. They target individuals with knowledge of hidden assets, then use elaborate impersonation schemes to extract the necessary information." Miss Marple's knitting needles had ceased their rhythmic clicking as she absorbed these revelations. The pattern was becoming clearer, though she sensed that the full picture remained tantalizingly elusive. "Miss Hartwell, when this impostor questioned you about the past, did he seem to know specific details, or did he guide you into providing the information he needed?" The question struck home with devastating accuracy. Miss Hartwell's remaining defenses crumbled entirely. "Now that you mention it, he never volunteered memories of his own. He would make vague references, then wait for me to fill in the details, like an actor following another performer's lead." "Precisely," Miss Marple said gently. "And yet someone provided him with enough authentic information to make his performance convincing." Someone who knew both you and Mrs. Ashworth well enough to understand which memories would be most persuasive. From her coat pocket, Miss Hartwell produced a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with distinctive red wax bearing an unfamiliar crest. He gave me this before he left, said it contained evidence that would clear his name if anything happened to him. I was to deliver it to a London address if he failed to make contact by tomorrow morning. Inspector Mallory accepted the envelope with professional interest, though Miss Marple noticed his slight frown as he examined the seal. The crest was elaborate but unfamiliar, suggesting either a genuine aristocratic connection or a very sophisticated forgery. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "I believe we are dealing with something far more complex than simple fraud. The theatrical elements, the carefully staged disappearance, the missing weapon, all suggest a level of planning that goes beyond mere financial gain." She rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the darkened grounds where shadows seemed to hold secrets of their own. Someone wanted us to believe in a romantic elopement gone wrong while concealing a far more sinister truth. The question we must ask ourselves is this: if the impostor didn't simply flee when his scheme failed, what actually became of him? The drawing room fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sound of wind stirring the laurel hedges. Miss Marple understood with quiet certainty that the vanishing guest at Heather Lodge had not merely disappeared, he had been eliminated by forces far more dangerous than anyone yet suspected. The real investigation, she knew, was only now beginning to reveal its true dimensions. As the church clock chimed 9, its melancholy notes drifting across grounds where shadows concealed secrets that would soon demand their reckoning, Miss Marple prepared herself for the psychological battle that lay ahead. The puppet master, she was increasingly certain, was far closer to home than anyone yet imagined. Inspector Mallory's methodical nature asserted itself immediately, transforming the drawing room of Heather Lodge into an impromptu command center. He dispatched Constable Morrison to secure the grounds and prevent any departures, while requesting additional personnel from the county headquarters. The weight of official investigation settled over the house like a heavy shroud, muffling even the ordinary sounds of evening routine. Miss Marple remained in her chair by the fireplace, her knitting needles moving with deceptive casualness while her sharp eyes catalogued every reaction, every nervous gesture among the assembled company. She had learned long ago that people revealed more in the moments between official questions than during formal interrogation, and tonight's revelations had created precisely the kind of emotional pressure that stripped away careful facades. The first breakthrough came when Dr. Pemberton returned from his examination of the injured gardener. Pritchard had regained consciousness, though his memory remained frustratingly fragmented. He remembers approaching the potting shed around 4 o'clock, the doctor reported, consulting his notes. Someone called to him from the shadows near the laurel hedge, claimed to need assistance with a heavy pot. When he went to help, he was struck from behind. "Did he see his attacker?" Inspector Mallory inquired. "Not clearly, but he recalls 2 distinct impressions. First, the scent of lady's face powder, quite strong, as though someone had applied it recently or carelessly. Second, and more unusual, the fragrance of violets. He was quite emphatic about this, said it reminded him of his late wife's perfume." Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. Violets were not a common masculine fragrance, nor were they typically associated with the orris root scent she had detected on the silk pocket square. This suggested either a woman's involvement or someone who had been in very close contact with feminine toiletries. Inspector Mallory organized a systematic search of the guest room that had housed the mysterious Mr. Whitmore. The chamber told a story of careful preparation rather than hasty departure. The expensive clothing showed no signs of regular wear, the shaving kit remained pristine, and most tellingly, the writing desk contained what appeared to be a deliberately staged romantic letter addressed to Miss Hartwell. This correspondence was never intended for private delivery, Miss Marple observed, examining the melodramatic prose. It reads rather like something from a sensation novel designed to support a particular interpretation of events. More significant was her discovery of a small smear of theatrical grease paint on the windowsill, along with evidence that the window had been used for observation rather than ventilation. "Someone watched the entire garden party from this vantage point," she noted quietly. "They would have known precisely when to make their dramatic exit when the constable arrived, even when the search parties dispersed." The investigation took a more ominous turn when Evans reported that several items were missing from various parts of the house. The ice house key had vanished from its hook in the scullery, along with a small lantern typically used for evening inspections of the grounds. Most troubling of all, Lucy the housemaid had disappeared entirely, her room empty and a few possessions gone. "She left no message," Evans reported with obvious distress. "Simply vanished sometime after the evening meal was served. Most unlike her, Inspector. Lucy has been with us for 3 years and never showed the slightest inclination toward irregular behavior." As they pondered this development, Mr. Thornfield produced additional documentation from his leather portfolio. "Inspector, our investigation has uncovered something rather disturbing. The criminal organization we've been tracking doesn't simply impersonate their targets. They often eliminate them entirely, then use the impersonation to extract information from grieving or desperate relatives." The implications sent a chill through the assembled company. If the real Charles Montague had been murdered years ago, then someone at Heather Lodge possessed information valuable enough to justify this elaborate deception. Miss Marple found herself studying Dr. Pemberton with renewed interest. His medical knowledge would certainly explain the precise nature of Pritchard's injury, enough to incapacitate without causing permanent damage. Moreover, his quick organization of the initial search had conveniently directed attention away from the more secluded areas of the property where evidence might have been concealed. "Dr. Pemberton," she said with gentle curiosity, "you mentioned that Mr. Whitmore's stories reminded you of travel literature rather than personal experience. I wonder what specifically gave you that impression?" The doctor shifted uncomfortably under her mild gaze. "Simply that his descriptions lacked the sort of personal details one accumulates through actual experience. They were too polished, too perfectly structured. Rather like someone reciting from a well-rehearsed script." "How perceptive of you to notice," Miss Marple replied, "though I confess myself puzzled by one small detail. You examined his teacup quite thoroughly this afternoon, yet made no mention of the lemon residue that Evans later discovered. For a medical man, such attention to detail is usually second nature." A flicker of something, concern perhaps, or calculation, crossed Dr. Pemberton's features. "I was focused on the immediate circumstances of his disappearance, not the contents of his refreshment." Before Miss Marple could pursue this line of inquiry further, their discussion was interrupted by a commotion from the kitchen garden. Through the drawing-room windows, they could see lanterns bobbing among the vegetable plots and Evan's voice calling for immediate assistance. The party hurried outside to find that the missing ice house key had been discovered, dropped in the soft earth near the ornamental fountain. More significantly, a systematic search of the disused ice house itself had revealed signs of recent disturbance. Fresh scratches on the stone floor, a torn fragment of expensive fabric caught on the iron door, and most ominously, a small pool of what appeared to be blood near the far wall. "Someone was held here," Inspector Mallory concluded grimly. "The question is whether they left voluntarily or were removed by force." As they stood in the cold stone chamber, Miss Marple noticed something that had escaped the others' attention. Lodged in a crack between the flagstones was a tiny seed pearl, identical to those adorning Miss Hartwell's distinctive earrings. She retrieved it carefully with a hairpin, holding it up to catch the lantern light. "Most interesting," she murmured. "These little things do have a way of marking a trail, rather like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale." The discovery sent Miss Hartwell into near collapse, and she had to be supported by Mrs. Ashworth as they returned to the house. But Miss Marple noticed that her distress seemed less about the pearl itself than about its location. Someone had been very careless, or perhaps very desperate, to leave such obvious evidence in so compromising a place. As the church clock chimed 11, its melancholy notes drifting across grounds where shadows concealed secrets that grew more complex with each revelation, Miss Marple understood that the mystery of the vanishing guest was approaching its climax. The final confrontation would require all her psychological insight, for the murderer had proven both clever and ruthless, hiding behind a facade of respectability while orchestrating an elaborate deception. The truth, she knew with quiet certainty, lay not in the obvious suspects or theatrical clues, but in the small inconsistencies that revealed human nature at its most calculating. Tomorrow would bring the reckoning that little Wickham would remember for generations to come. The pale morning light filtering through the drawing-room windows of Heather Lodge revealed faces marked by a sleepless night and the weight of accumulating revelations. Miss Marple had requested that everyone gather precisely as they had been positioned during the previous afternoon's fateful garden party, and Inspector Mallory, recognizing the wisdom of her unconventional methods, had agreed to this reconstruction. Mrs. Ashworth stood near the French doors, her usual composure replaced by a brittle tension that seemed ready to shatter at the slightest provocation. Miss Hartwell had positioned herself by the elaborate tea service, her hands trembling as she attempted to recreate her careful ministrations from the day before. Dr. Pemberton remained near the platform area, his medical bag at hand, while Mr. Thornfield clutched his leather portfolio with obvious nervousness. Miss Marple settled into her chair beneath the window, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm as she observed the tableau with the quiet intensity of someone reading a particularly absorbing novel. "Now then," she said in her mildest tone, "let us consider what actually transpired yesterday afternoon, step by careful step." She looked up from her knitting with those deceptively innocent blue eyes. "Miss Hartwell, you were so attentive to Mr. Whitmore's refreshment needs. Could you show us precisely how you prepared his final cup of tea?" With obvious reluctance, Miss Hartwell lifted the teapot, her movements mechanical and strained. "I warmed the cup first, then plain tea exactly as he preferred. He was quite emphatic about avoiding lemon. And yet," Miss Marple observed gently, "Evans found clear evidence of lemon in the abandoned cup. Most curious, considering Mr. Whitmore's stated aversion. Unless, of course, someone else entirely had been drinking from that cup." The words fell into the morning stillness like stones cast into deep water. Miss Hartwell's face went ashen, and the teapot trembled in her grasp. "You see," Miss Marple continued, her needles never pausing, "I've been troubled by so many small inconsistencies. The silk pocket square scented with orris root, a distinctly feminine fragrance. The face powder traces on the lemon tongs. The wig hair caught in Mr. Whitmore's silver comb. The theatrical supplies hidden in the potting shed, all evidence of someone who had taken extraordinary care to transform their appearance." She set down her knitting and regarded Miss Hartwell with gentle but implacable authority. The person who impersonated Charles Montague possessed intimate knowledge of his past relationships with both you and Mrs. Ashworth. They knew which memories would prove most persuasive, which emotional appeals would be most effective. Such detailed knowledge could only come from someone who had heard these stories countless times, someone trusted with the most private confidences. Mrs. Ashworth stared at her companion in dawning horror. "Evelyn, what is Miss Marple saying?" "I'm saying, my dear Mrs. Ashworth, that Sebastian Whitmore never existed except as a role played by someone we have already met." Miss Hartwell created this elaborate impersonation, using her theatrical skills acquired during her time in London to transform herself into the man you both remembered. The confession that followed came in broken whispers, each word extracted like a splinter from an infected wound. Miss Hartwell had discovered documentation among Mrs. Ashworth's family papers, proving that Charles Montague had indeed stolen substantial sums before his business collapsed. Unable to bear her benefactor's financial struggles, she had conceived an increasingly desperate plan to recover the missing funds through emotional manipulation and carefully staged romance. But something went terribly wrong, Miss Marple continued quietly. The real Charles Montague learned of your scheme, didn't he? He came to Heather Lodge to confront you, to stop this elaborate deception. Miss Hartwell's remaining composure shattered entirely. He arrived yesterday morning before the garden party. He was furious, threatened to expose everything. Said he would ruin both Cordelia and me if I didn't cease this madness immediately. And so you led him to the ice house, Miss Marple said with infinite gentleness. Perhaps you told him you had hidden the recovered documents there, or promised to abandon your scheme if he would only listen to your explanation. But you had already taken Mrs. Ashworth's service revolver from the study safe. The truth emerged like blood from a wound that could no longer be stanched. Miss Hartwell had struck Charles Montague with the revolver, the blow proving fatal. In her panic, she had enlisted Dr. Pemberton's unwitting assistance, claiming that Charles had suffered a heart attack and needed to be moved discreetly to avoid scandal. The doctor's medical knowledge had helped her understand how to stage the elaborate disappearance, though he remained unaware of the true circumstances. The seed pearl from your earring, found in the ice house, Miss Marple observed. You lost it during the struggle, didn't you? And poor Pritchard, struck down because he witnessed you moving the body. Lucy disappeared because she saw too much and you feared her testimony. As Inspector Mallory placed Miss Hartwell under arrest, the full scope of the tragedy became clear. What had begun as misguided loyalty had spiraled into murder, deception, and the destruction of everything Miss Hartwell had sought to protect. Mrs. Ashworth watched in stunned silence as her trusted companion was led away, the woman she had known replaced by a stranger capable of elaborate deception and ultimately violence. The aftermath. The scandal that engulfed Little Wickham would be remembered for generations, though the full details were carefully managed to protect Mrs. Ashworth's reputation. Dr. Pemberton, cleared of any criminal involvement but deeply shaken by his unwitting participation, temporarily closed his practice to recover from the ordeal. Lucy was found safe but traumatized, her testimony crucial in understanding the complete sequence of events. Miss Marple remained at Heather Lodge for several more days, her quiet presence a comfort to Mrs. Ashworth as the older woman struggled to comprehend how thoroughly she had been deceived by someone she had trusted implicitly. The garden party's cheerful remnants were cleared away, leaving only memories of how quickly ordinary life could be transformed by the darker impulses of human nature. As she prepared for her departure, Miss Marple reflected on the case's painful lessons. Miss Hartwell's genuine desire to help her benefactor had led her down a path of increasingly elaborate deceptions, each lie requiring another to support it, until murder became the only way to prevent the entire structure from collapsing. It's always the small kindnesses that prove most dangerous, she mused to Inspector Mallory during their final conversation. When people convince themselves that their motives are pure, they become capable of the most extraordinary self-deception. Miss Hartwell genuinely believed she was acting out of love and loyalty, right up until the moment she pulled that trigger. The vanishing guest at Heather Lodge had indeed disappeared, but not through romantic flight or criminal conspiracy. He had been eliminated by someone who should have been his friend, a victim of misguided devotion that had transformed love into something monstrous. The truth, as always in Miss Marple's experience, proved far more complex and heartbreaking than the carefully constructed fiction designed to conceal it. As the train carried her back to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple gazed out at the peaceful English countryside and reflected on humanity's infinite capacity for both self-sacrifice and self-destruction. The mystery was solved, justice would be served, but the scars left on Little Wickham would take far longer to heal than the time required to unravel even the most elaborate deception.